Evelyn Harper Cole didn't lose everything in a single day. Richard Cole had taken exactly 18 months to dismantle her life, cleanly, quietly, every move papered over in legal ink. By the time he filed for divorce, the house no longer carried her name. The savings had vanished from every account she'd ever known. And 32 years spent holding up his world had been compressed into a figure so small it felt like a slap. What she walked away with? An old car, a handful of personal things, and $21,000. 3 weeks after that, Evelyn spent nearly every cent of it on an abandoned restaurant nobody wanted. Not a soul understood the decision. Maybe she didn't fully understand it herself. But some choices only come when a person has nothing left to protect. And those are the choices that remake a life. If you've ever wondered what happens when a woman stripped of everything still refuses to stop moving, stay until the end. And if stories like this speak to you, don't forget to subscribe to the channel to support us. Because what waited for Evelyn inside that old kitchen went far deeper than dust and darkness and forgotten things. Evelyn Harper Cole stood at the threshold of a room behind the kitchen for almost 2 full minutes. The door hung open already, but her body held back, kept that small distance, as though one more step forward meant crossing into something she wasn't ready to name. She'd come to remeasure the kitchen, to take notes, to decide what could be salvaged and what needed tearing out. The small notebook was still in her hand, its pages marked with numbers and question marks in her tight, careful script. Not a single line mentioned this room, but the room was there. And she had opened it. The smell wasn't just dust. Something older lived in it, deeper, like air that had been holding its breath for years, sealed and undisturbed. Light from the kitchen behind her reached a few feet across the floor, then quit, as if it too refused to go further. Everything inside was drowned in pale gray, broken chairs stacked onto each other. A dented metal cabinet leaning against nothing. Cardboard boxes soft at the corners, their edges chewed away by dampness and time. 8 years. That's what the seller had told her. 8 years shuttered. No one had touched this room in all that time. Evelyn could have turned around. She could have pulled the door closed, gone back to her notebook, back to the list of problems already long enough without adding another. She had more than enough weight on her shoulders. She stood 1 beat longer, then stepped inside. At the far wall, a row of large wooden crates sat beneath a heavy tarp. They weren't tossed in with the rest of the wreckage. They were arranged with care, lined up, deliberate, as if someone had placed them there with clear purpose and then walked away without returning. She moved closer. Her fingers met the tarp. Dust lifted, less than she'd expected. She pulled the canvas down with one hand. Glass jars. Evelyn straightened. For several seconds, she did absolutely nothing. The jars stood in neat rows, 4 or 5 to a row, more than 24 in all. But it was the faded handwriting on the labels that stopped her cold. The metal lids had gone dark with age but held firm. The paper labels pasted to the glass had softened, their ink bleeding lighter year after year. But the words were still readable. She bent and lifted one jar. The glass was cold against her palm, heavier than she'd expected. Inside, something dark brown, edging toward red, thick with time. She brought it closer to her face, and her eyes caught the handwritten line across the label. Blue Porch Fig Preserve. Mabel Louise Harper, Savannah, Georgia. She didn't move. Her grandmother's name rested in her hands inside a room that had been sealed for 8 years, in a city where she never imagined her life would land. Evelyn didn't set the jar down right away. She held it there, reading each word again, slowly, deliberately, as if rushing might make the letters dissolve. She hadn't seen that name written out in a very long time. Evelyn had grown up in the kitchen behind a small wooden house in Savannah, where summer always arrived a little early and never seemed in any hurry to leave. Her grandmother never used the word products. They were fig preserve, chutney jars lined in rows on wooden shelves, glass catching whatever light the room offered. People came for them. Some paid. Some didn't. It depended on the season, the circumstance, the unspoken understanding between neighbors. Mabel kept almost no records, but everything she made carried its own signature, a rhythm in the process, a particular method, a scent Evelyn could identify before she even crossed the threshold. Lightly spiced, deeply sweet, and beneath both, some nameless layer that lived in the back of her memory but had never found a word. She set the jar down, then she pulled the tarp all the way back. What lay underneath was more than she'd expected. The wooden crates didn't hold a few dozen jars. They were lined with paper, packed in careful layers, each one filled with jars identical to the last. Some labels had bled into soft smudges. Others remained sharp enough to read. Every single one bore the same name. Evelyn dropped to her knees. Her hands moved faster now. No longer the hands of someone looking. She was searching, opening each crate, checking every layer. In one corner, tucked beneath the final jars, she found a bundle of papers, bound with string. She drew it out. The paper had yellowed, but held together. Letters, handwritten invoices, brief notes in familiar script. One name repeated across nearly every page: Nadine Porter. Evelyn turned each sheet. The dates spanned years, many years. The lines described quantities, the quality of individual batches, which ones needed more time, which had already reached readiness. This was not the archive of a hobbyist. This was a chain of exchange, systematic, consistent, stretching back farther than Evelyn had imagined. She turned to the end of the bundle. At the bottom lay thicker documents, typed, signed. She pulled them free and spread them across her knees. Her eyes slowed. She read each line the way a person reads something that might change the shape of everything that follows. The name Mabel Louise Harper sat at the top. Below it, the terms: ownership rights, production rights, distribution rights, and one line where her gaze stopped longer than on any other: and to her direct heirs. Evelyn did not keep reading, not right away. She held the page. Her eyes rested on that final phrase. Her hand was steady, no tremor. She simply sat, still, surrounded by wooden crates and glass jars, and something she had not yet named. Not opportunity. Not yet anything at all. Outside, kitchen metal clinked softly as wind moved through the back door. She still hadn't stood up. The next morning she brought the entire file to the law office on Meeting Street. A coarse canvas tote bag with worn handles carried everything. She arrived 15 minutes early, sat in the reception area, watched through the glass doors as cars crawled through the intersection in a slow, patient line. Charleston in late morning had a way about it, elegant and exhausted in equal measure. A city that had mastered the art of looking composed while something inside quietly crumbled. Evelyn set the bag on her lap, both hands resting on top. She didn't open a notebook, didn't check her phone. She waited. The lawyer's name was Diane Mercer, 52 years old, precise without being cold. She led Evelyn into her office, drew the documents from the bag, and began reading them in order. Not skimming, not rushing. Every letter, every invoice, every contract, given its full weight. Evelyn sat across from her, hands on her knees, watching the black fountain pen in Diane's grip trace the edges of each page. Slow, deliberate, as though confirming the outline of something that mattered. Nearly 40 minutes passed before she reached the end. Diane placed the documents flat on the desk, removed her glasses, looked directly at Evelyn. How many years before your marriage did your grandmother register the rights to this brand?
6 years.
And you are the sole direct heir?
Yes.
Diane nodded. Once. Then the foundation is clear. What passed to you through inheritance, rights established before the marriage, is not marital property. Not unless there was later commingling of assets or some transfer of rights. I don't see evidence that anything like that occurred. Evelyn didn't respond immediately. She listened to each word as though hearing a language she had always known but never once heard spoken on her behalf. Diane slid the contract section slightly forward. Quote 5. Outside the door, a printer whirred to life and fell silent. Evelyn dipped her chin. Quote 6. Quote 7. Diane spread open her planner. Quote 8. Quote. That same afternoon, back at the restaurant, the phone rang. Claire's name blazed across the screen so bright, Evelyn had to squint to read it. She stood beside the old wooden counter. Let it ring a few beats longer than necessary. Then picked up. Are you at the restaurant? Claire asked, her voice airy, as though nothing had ever passed between them that should make either one careful. Yes. How's it all going? Still looking into things. Claire asked about the electrician, the permits, whether the water line needed repair. Small questions, weightless ones, delivered at exactly the right pace, like someone filling silence for the sake of filling it. Then her tone shifted, just barely. Did you find anything in there? In the rooms toward the back? Evelyn stared into the darkness pooling at the far end of the kitchen. Some old papers. What kind of papers? Letters, invoices. Claire went quiet for 2 full seconds. Related to the previous owner? Yes. Then you probably need to be careful. Dad says places like that usually come tangled up in ownership problems. Evelyn tightened her grip on the phone. Claire had not said a single wrong word. That was the most remarkable thing about her, from childhood straight through to adulthood. She almost never stated directly what she wanted to know. She circled it, orbited the thing patiently until the other person laid the information between them with their own hands, never realizing what they just surrendered. Evelyn said. A soft laugh floated through the speaker. The call ended shortly after. Evelyn set the phone on the counter and went back to measuring the gap between the stove and the prep station. She wrote the number in her notebook. The front door swung wide and banged shut. A tall white man in a pale blue shirt stood framed in the doorway, scanning the room. Mid-50s, silver threading both temples. His jacket hung loose over one arm. Men like him never needed to raise their voices for a room to know they'd arrived. Mrs. Cole? Evelyn put down her pen. I'm Julian Mercer. She knew that name instantly. Mercer Table. Mercer Provisions. Mercer Southern Pantry. His profile had turned up in every food and business magazine she could name. A man who'd begun with a single food counter in Macon and built it into a full chain. Handcrafted Southern goods, premium packaging, regional distribution across the South. Julian walked slowly to the counter and laid a business card in front of her. __quote _26___. Evelyn glanced at the card but didn't touch it. What brings you to me? Blue Porch Fig Preserve. He spoke that name the way a person speaks something they've rehearsed silently for a long time before ever saying it out loud. Julian paused. His gaze drifted past her toward the empty kitchen. Evelyn rested her weight against the counter's edge. Are you here to buy it? No, he shook his head. I didn't drive more than 200 miles to purchase a name outright. I came to find out whether the heir understands what she's holding. She studied him for a moment. I'm not entirely sure yet. Julian nodded, slowly, deliberately. as though that were the precise answer he'd been hoping to hear. Underscore, underscore, quote, underscore, 35, underscore, underscore. He asked if he could return the following morning with a summary of what his team had pulled together. No pressure behind the words, no figure dangled, no contract language at all. On his way out, Julian paused at the door and turned back with a question Evelyn hadn't braced for. What did your grandmother's kitchen smell like on hot days? The answer left her mouth before thought could catch it. Ripe figs, apple vinegar, brown sugar, and something spicier than people guessed. Julian held still for a single beat, then nodded. I'll be back at 10. He walked out. The door settled shut behind him. A small, clean click. Evelyn reached for her pen but didn't write another word. The phone on the counter buzzed once more. Not Claire, not the lawyer. The screen carried a name she had scrubbed from every routine but never from her memory. Richard Cole. She let it ring through once, then fall silent. Seconds later the screen glowed again. Same name. She looked at it without reaching. Richard had always possessed the talent for reappearing at the precise moment something began taking shape without him. Across 32 years, he had seldom walked into a room while things were still in disarray. He waited until the table was set, the guests seated, the contract drawn up. Only then did he step in, as though the entire scene had been his doing. The divorce followed that same pattern. Evelyn picked up on the third call. Underscore, underscore, quote, underscore, 39, underscore, underscore, Richard said, voice low, even, unhurried. That voice had once convinced other people he was a man of restraint, of judgment, of composure when things grew difficult. Evelyn knew the truth. It was simply the voice of someone who had never been forced to pay immediately for what he'd done. I know, she said. Claire mentioned you're dealing with some paperwork at the new restaurant. She waved towards the counter. Is that so? She's just worried about you. That's none of your business. Richard went quiet for a short beat. If anything involves old ownership rights, outstanding debt, or prior contracts, you should let my lawyer look it over before you sign. Assets discovered during post-divorce proceedings are sometimes more complicated than people realize. By the time those words landed, she had pulled out a chair and sat. His way of selecting every word hadn't changed. He never stated what he wanted directly. He only constructed a frame of language so other people had to step inside it themselves. Evelyn said, the line went noticeably quieter. When Richard spoke again, his voice remained soft, only a shade lower. Evelyn looked through the restaurant's front window. Across the street, a delivery man pushed a cart stacked with soft drink crates along the sidewalk. A young couple carrying a small child passed by. The city kept moving through its ordinary business, while the man who had once shared more than half her life tried to lay his hand back on something that no longer belonged to him. I'm busy, she said. Evelyn, she gave him nothing. If a new asset has appeared, I need to know. I'm not discussing this in a personal capacity. You never did anything in a personal capacity. She ended the call. That afternoon, Diane Mercer sent an email. The petition establishing inheritance rights and the right to use the brand had been filed. A handful of items still needed supplementing. Those would be completed within 3 days. At the bottom of the message said one line, shorter than the rest. I think your ex-husband will react quickly. Please forward every communication to me, if there is any. The next morning, Julian Mercer arrived at 10 o'clock sharp, exactly as he'd said. He carried a thin, cream-colored folder and a box of photographic copies, and he did not come alone. The young woman beside him introduced herself as Lena, heritage brand researcher at his company. They didn't enter the restaurant like people who had come to convince an owner to sign. They spread documents across the table near the window, like people opening a family file that had been lost for a very long time. Lena placed in front of Evelyn photocopied menus from 3 restaurants, 2 in Savannah, 1 in Beaufort, dating back to the 1990s. Next to listings for cured meats, buttermilk biscuits, and baked cheese sat brief annotations. Served with Blue Porch Fig Preserve. A clipping from a regional magazine, 1998, described a lightly spiced fig preserve made by Mabel Harper. A preserve that a handful of chefs across the area still quietly tracked down. There was also a business card from a specialty shop in Augusta, its corners soft and wrinkled. On the back, someone had scrawled in a hurried hand, ___quote _ 55 ___. Evelyn brushed her fingertips along the edge of the yellowed paper. She had never known her grandmother's reach had stretched that far beyond the small kitchen behind the house. Julian sat across from her, both hands flat on the table, motionless. I don't need to explain that this is something sellable. You've lived long enough to recognize commercial value when it's sitting in front of you. But what I'm telling you is that it carries more than that. It carries history. It carries absence. And now, it carries a living presence. What do you want from me? Evelyn asked. A real partnership, Julian said. The name stays yours. The formula stays yours. Every decision stays yours. I bring production infrastructure, distribution channels, a legal team, the experience to reintroduce this to market without turning it into some counterfeit nostalgia product. And this restaurant, if you want to reopen it, reopen it. If you want the brand and the restaurant running side by side, even better. He motioned toward the kitchen, then let silence settle between them. Enough quiet for the conversation to shed its transactional weight.
Julian glanced around the room.
You actually plan to cook here? Yes. Then don't let anyone redesign this place until it no longer recognizes itself. After they left, Evelyn picked up her phone and called Sharon Bell on the old number still saved in her contacts. 2 attempts before someone answered. Sharon spoke carefully, the way a person speaks when she's learned that bad news usually arrives before the first sentence finishes. A beat of silence on the other end. Sharon exhaled, barely audible. Evelyn at the other end, a vacuum cleaner droned down a hallway and then faded to nothing. Sharon didn't respond right away. When she did, her voice had dropped, not trembling, held tight. I tried to tell you. I know. I didn't have proof then. You still said it. Sharon asked for a single day to put things in order. Evelyn agreed. The call ended. She opened her email one more time and found a new message from Diane Mercer, sent less than 7 minutes before. The subject line contained only 4 words. Petition filed this afternoon. Evelyn opened it. Richard Cole, acting through his legal counsel, had formally petitioned the court to review Blue Porch Fig Preserve as an asset with elements arising during the period of marital dissolution, eligible for inclusion in the supplemental division. Attached to the filing was a chain of messages and internal notes confirming details about the brand's discovery in the documents found inside the restaurant. Most of it sourced from communications provided by Claire. Evelyn read the entire petition twice. Then she printed every page on the old machine wedged into the corner of the counter. Each sheet crawled out slowly. The stack was thin, but thick enough for a person to understand that certain attacks don't need volume to poison the air in a room. She clipped the pages together, slid them into a file folder, drove to Diane Mercer's office that same afternoon. Diane had already reviewed the electronic copy before Evelyn walked through the door. She didn't direct her client to the reception area. Instead, she led her straight to the small meeting room in the back. An oval wooden table, 2 glasses of water, a narrow window facing the parking lot. Nothing in that room was designed to impress, only to make words land without obstruction. "They're running a double strategy," Diane said, flipping the file open to the appendix. First track. Argue the brand's real value only materialized after you uncovered it during post-divorce proceedings. Second track. Paint a picture that you knowingly hid an asset that should have been on the table. "I didn't even know it existed before then. They know that." Diane pressed her finger against the bottom edge of the final page. "This isn't about winning on merit. This is about grinding you down, delay, pressure, fatigue, until you fold and hand over concessions before anything reaches a real conclusion." Evelyn sat straight in her chair, absorbing every syllable. Claire had given them everything. Even the check-in calls? Diane offered nothing more. What was on paper spoke loudly enough without embellishment. A chain of messages between Claire and Richard's attorney had been printed out and stapled into the file. Timestamps spaced days apart, then weeks, stretching from the moment Evelyn purchased the restaurant all the way through to the inheritance claim filing. Claire hadn't fabricated a single thing. She had simply forwarded what her mother shared during phone conversations that Evelyn believed were just family calls. Diane closed the folder. "The first hearing will move fast. I don't believe their position has real footing, but this won't end after one lawsuit unless he meets a wall hard enough on the very first swing. He always circles back when he senses there's still something left to strip away. Then this time, we let him circle back where everyone can watch." 3 days later, Evelyn stepped into the courtroom wearing the old cream-colored jacket she'd last put on for Ethan's final parent-teacher conference in high school. Not for sentiment. Only because it fit, drew no attention, and didn't ask her to spend one more ounce of thought on something that didn't matter. Richard occupied the opposite table alongside his lawyer and Ethan. Navy suit, narrow striped tie, that nearly flawless composure of a man long accustomed to entering rooms where the outcome already leaned his way. Ethan looked older than 37, not in his hair or his features, but in the tension cinching the corners of his mouth and the rigid lock of his shoulders. He never glanced toward his mother. Phone, documents, phone again. The restless motion of someone convinced he still held control as long as his hands stayed occupied. The hearing ran shorter than Richard had planned for. The judge, a woman in her 60s, voice level, expression betraying almost nothing, reviewed the original contract language, cross-referenced the brand registration date against Evelyn's marriage date, then directed a single question at Richard's attorney. On what precise basis did he contend that a separately inherited asset could become disputed property simply because its discovery came late? The lawyer pivoted toward newly emergent commercial value, toward the need for extended review given concealment concerns, toward the trail of information supplied by the daughter. The judge absorbed all of it without a single interruption. When he finished, she looked down at the file one final time, then set her pen aside. "There is no basis." 4 words. Richard's attorney was already drawing breath to request supplemental proceedings, but the judge continued, one deliberate beat slower. This brand was established independently prior to the marriage. Inheritance rights belonged to Mrs. Cole, per the original documentation. The court finds no evidence of asset commingling and no disclosure obligation breached based on what has been presented. The request for supplemental review is denied. The hearing dissolved almost immediately after. Richard didn't turn toward Evelyn. A slight tilt of his head toward his lawyer. Something spoken under his breath. Papers gathered. Ethan rose more slowly and fumbled a pen onto the floor. Plastic striking stone, the sharp little crack of it echoing through a room already nearly empty. 4 days later, the first article surfaced in the local business section.
Not about the fig preserve brand.
About the dismissed dispute filing and the names threaded through appendix documents tied to several older coal development transactions. A reporter started pulling that thread, tracing from the legal architecture of this case into other records. 2 weeks later, a federal investigative office issued a records preservation request to Richard's company. Ethan called Evelyn early on a Friday afternoon. No small talk, no warmth circling the edges. Did you say anything to anyone? No. Did you give your lawyer anything beyond the brand file? No. Has anyone from an investigative agency contacted you yet? Silence held the line for a few seconds. Then Ethan pressed again, something tighter in his voice now. If they do contact you, what will you say? The truth. A sharp breath through his nose. You always think everything is that simple. No, I just stopped helping other people make it more complicated. Ethan hung up without a goodbye. That same week, Sharon showed up in Charleston. Small gray suitcase, 2 pairs of work shoes wrapped in cloth bags. She stood at the restaurant door at 7 in the morning, hair pulled back tight, white blouse pressed clean. And she did not carry the look of someone arriving to ask for anything. She carried the posture of a woman who had already decided. Evelyn walked her through the new floor plan, the counter area, table placements, where the register would sit, where the shift board would hang. Sharon moved through the space once and asked exactly the questions that mattered. How many in the kitchen? Whether servers would rotate by shift or hold fixed stations? Which door for deliveries? Whether the customer restroom would be ready before the soft opening. Neither of them brought up the old house in Atlanta. Neither of them touched what had happened when Sharon left. By the end of that morning, while they were checking the standing refrigerator one more time, Evelyn's phone lit up. Unknown number. A single line of text. I'm Daniel Whitman, Claire's husband. I think you should know what my wife sent to her father. Evelyn did not answer right away. She laid the phone face down on the stainless steel counter and went back to the delivery list with Sharon. 24 deep plates, 18 baking trays, 4 boxes of cloth towels, 2 produce suppliers who needed calling back. Their delivery windows had slipped past what was promised. Everything solid. Everything countable. Everything she could hold in her hands. She moved through each task until no reason remained to put off the call. Early afternoon, she walked to the back of the restaurant, stood by the delivery door, dialed Daniel Whitman's number. He picked up on the second ring. His voice was worn thin. No layer of courtesy, no careful warmth people usually wrap around themselves the first time they speak to a mother-in-law. Mrs. Cole, yes. I don't know the right way to make this call anymore. Daniel paused for half a breath. I read the file attached to the email the lawyer sent Claire. Then I kept going through her phone. I think you need to see what I found. He didn't stretch it out. He sent screenshot after screenshot while they were still talking. Claire's messages to Richard. To Richard's lawyer, to some assistant at the office. The dates and times spread across months. Mom is checking the back room again. Mom says there are papers. Mom has called a lawyer. Mom met someone named Julian Mercer this morning. This looks bigger than we thought. Evelyn watched each image appear on the screen. No apology threaded between the lines. No hesitation. Just information handed over. Steady, clean, efficient. Daniel went on. __quote _ 83 __. Where is she? Evelyn asked. At our house. Not for much longer, though. He exhaled. I spoke to my own lawyer this morning. Evelyn saved every image into a separate folder, forwarded them to Diane. 5 minutes later, Diane replied. 1 sentence. Keep everything. Do not respond to Claire in writing.
The next 3 weeks moved in a dense, unbroken rhythm. The diner started becoming real. Walls repainted a pale cream. The wooden bar counter sanded smooth,
then sealed with fresh oil. 2 burners replaced on the industrial stove. Ventilation system repaired. Sharon hired staff her own way. She didn't pick the ones who talked fastest. She picked the ones who looked you in the eye and waited for the full question before they opened their mouths. Evelyn stood over the stove with the temporary head chef beside her, working through Mabel's notebook recipe by recipe. Brown sugar ratios adjusted, apple vinegar measured and remeasured, mustard seeds counted out by the quarter teaspoon. Black pepper ground fresh, then ground again when the first batch tasted flat. Julian Mercer passed through Charleston nearly every week, not always carrying contracts or proposals. Some visits he showed up with nothing but a box of sample glass jars, setting them on the counter and asking Evelyn whether the first batch of Blue Porch fig preserve should go out in wide mouth or narrow mouth. Other visits he sat at the window table, tasting 3 versions of the same recipe in silence, then pushing one jar forward and saying the best version was always the one that stopped the person mid-bite, gave them something familiar they couldn't quite name. Meanwhile, the investigation file connected to Richard refused to sit still. Coverage had already drifted past the local page. A law firm out of Columbia filed suit on behalf of 2 former partners of coal development. The allegation that the transfer and asset preservation structure in earlier deals had been designed to hide real beneficial interests. Ethan's name appeared in multiple appendices. His signature sat on documents nobody had bothered to read carefully before. He called Evelyn one more time. His voice came through rougher than before, scraped raw. "Mom, you really can't do anything." She stood in the kitchen. One hand gripped a wooden spoon. The other pinned the phone between her shoulder and her ear. "What are you asking me to do?" "Stop them. Make it clear that this didn't start with you, that you're not involved." "If I'm not involved, then I'll say I'm not involved." "But they're tracing into the old part too." "The old part is where you put your signature." Ethan went quiet. She could hear the air conditioner grinding hard on the other end. A late office. A row of lit cubicles. A 37-year-old man arriving at the understanding that paperwork does not always protect the hand that signs it. "Dad says you'd want to see us collapse. Your father has always believed everything revolves around what other people want for him." Ethan did not call again. Claire's name appeared on the screen Sunday evening, just after the test kitchen had gone dark. Sharon Bell was counting glasses and cups at the front counter. Evelyn looked at her daughter's name for a long moment. Then she stepped out through the back door into the yard before answering. Wind carried the smell of brackish water from the harbor. The sky hadn't gone fully dark yet. "Mom," Claire said. That single word told Evelyn everything had shifted inside her daughter's life. Shifted out of its old arrangement. Not because regret had softened her voice, because for the first time Claire was no longer speaking from a position of safety. "What is it Daniel knows?" Evelyn said nothing. "He checked my phone. He read everything." Claire swallowed dryly. "He already moved into another room. Tomorrow morning I have to meet with a lawyer." "Is that so? Don't talk like that, Mom." Claire's voice went thin, sharpened, urgent. "I was only trying to keep everything from getting worse. Dad said if a new asset appeared and no one controlled it, the legal side would drag on and you'd end up losing more." "You're 34 years old." Claire fell silent. "Adults cannot keep calling what they do being led, forever. You don't understand. I understand very clearly." On the other end, quick breathing, then a door shutting. Maybe Claire stood in the apartment parking lot. Maybe she had turned her back on her own home to call her mother for the first time, not to gather information, but to find somewhere to lean. "I need a place to stay for a few days,"
Claire said. Just a few days. Evelyn looked out across the backyard, growing darker. Crates of produce would arrive in the morning. When I needed a place to stay, you did not call. Claire started to say something. Evelyn had already ended the call. 2 days later, she drove to a nursing home in North Charleston. Nadine Porter was 83. Smaller than Evelyn had expected, but her eyes still held light and her memory still carried enough weight to recognize the name Mabel Harper in the very first sentence of introduction.
Nadine sat still for a long time after Evelyn said she was Mabel's granddaughter. She did not ask again, did not question it. She only placed her thin hand on the arm of her chair and looked straight at Evelyn, the way a person looks when they stopped hoping for news a long time ago and the news arrived anyway. __quote _84 __, Nadine said. When the restaurant closed, she had planned to call. By the time she tracked down the number, people told her Mabel was very ill. Not long after, Mabel was gone. Nadine didn't know who was supposed to receive them. The two women sat together for close to 2 hours. Nadine spoke about deliveries wrapped in old cloth, about how Mabel always wrote the cooking date on every lid, about how she had refused to raise the price, even when Nadine insisted customers would gladly pay more. Before she left, Evelyn told Nadine she wanted to arrange a monthly payment from the restaurant's profits once it opened. Nadine's face tightened. She was about to refuse. Evelyn said only one thing. You kept them for me for 8 years. That evening, back at the restaurant, Sharon was hanging the temporary shift board on the wall near the counter. Staff names written in a clean, straight line, black ink. At the very top, front of house manager Sharon Bell. Opening morning started before the sun had fully cleared the horizon. Sharon arrived at 5:30, hair pulled into a tight bun, a stack of invoices pressed under one arm, a pencil tucked behind her ear, as though she had owned this space for years. Bread delivery came before 6. Vegetables followed 15 minutes later. Buttercream, bacon, cornmeal, eggs, apple vinegar, brown sugar. The first glass jars of small batch Blue Porch fig preserve, meant for the counter, were carried inside in such deliberate order that the kitchen already sounded alive before all the lights had even come on. A place that was truly running. Evelyn stood at the prep table, apron knotted tight around her waist, checking the sauce again for the slow-roasted meat. Behind her on the stove, the preserve pot simmered gently over low flame. Ripe figs, cinnamon, cloves, apple vinegar, black pepper. The smell moved through the kitchen in layers, deepening, folding, then merging with the scent of hot butter and onions hitting the pan. Marisol, a young prep cook slicing onions, lifted her head and said quietly, "There are already people lining up out there." Sharon didn't look up from the reservation board. __quote _86 __. At 10 minutes to 10, Julian Mercer walked through the front door. No flowers, no wine, just a wooden frame wrapped in brown paper. He moved straight past the still empty tables into the kitchen and set it on the stainless steel counter. __quote _87 __. Evelyn peeled away the paper. Inside was a photograph she had lent Julian the day before to be scanned. Mabel Louise Harper. Standing in front of the old porch in Savannah, short-sleeved dress, hair rolled neatly up, holding 2 jars of preserve in both hands. Smiling, the way a person smiles when they don't need to explain something they know is good. The frame was simple, pale oak, clear glass. No ornate border, no nameplate. Evelyn picked it up, looked at it for a long moment, then told Marisol to watch the sauce for 2 minutes. She carried the photograph out herself, to the wall beside the kitchen door, the spot where everyone walking into the dining room would see it. Sharon handed her the small hammer and the nail she had already prepared. Nobody said another word. The photograph was hung at eye level. When the doors opened, the line on the sidewalk already stretched past half the storefront. Some were neighbors, people who had walked by for weeks watching the renovation, and now they came. Some were downtown guests who had heard the restaurant's name through a short post about a southern kitchen reviving a lost fig preserve recipe. 2 older couples had driven from Savannah because they'd seen the name Blue Porch in a small article by Julian. 15 minutes after opening, every table was full. Sharon moved through the dining room as if every chair corner, every gap between tables had been measured to the rhythm of her own steps. She adjusted water glasses, pulled up an extra chair for a table of 4, guided an elderly couple closer to the window because the husband had difficulty hearing near the bar. The servers found a steadier rhythm. Order chimes fired rapidly across the kitchen. The sound of pots and pans, oven doors opening and closing, people calling out to one another in short, clear phrases that meant nothing and everything at once. The kind of talk that only happens when a room is working the way it should. Right in the thick of that first rush, Diane Mercer walked in. A man in a grey shirt followed her, no tie. They took the last table against the wall. Evelyn barely had time to lift her chin in greeting. Her hands were already plating. Near the end of the meal, Diane stepped into the kitchen. She placed a thin envelope on the edge of the counter. She spoke just loud enough to cut through the hum of the ventilation system. Federal prosecutors had officially opened a file on Richard Cole. Several coal development transactions were under review. Ethan was not facing charges at this time, but his professional standing, whatever had been left of it, was effectively over. Richard had lost 2 major investors that morning. "I thought you should know." Evelyn nodded once. "Thank you." Diane glanced through the pass toward the packed dining room. Guests were reaching across tables, passing around sample jars of preserve, placed at the center like something both familiar and sacred. "You have other things to do today," Diane said. Then she walked back out. Lunch bled into the early afternoon with no gap worth naming. A local food critic sat alone near the door. Quiet. Watchful, ordered biscuits, pan-seared chicken, and a jar of preserve to take home. A group of older women gathered beneath Mabel's photograph on the wall. They stood there a long time before asking to be seated. One of them turned to Sharon Bell, asked if the woman in the picture was the owner's grandmother. Sharon answered without hesitating. "She is the reason this place is here today." Somewhere around 3 o'clock, Evelyn's phone buzzed inside her apron pocket. She didn't have a free hand. More than an hour passed before the first wave finally thinned and the kitchen fell into takeout rhythm. She pulled the phone out. 3 missed calls from Richard, 1 from Claire, 1 voicemail she hadn't heard. She looked at the screen for a few seconds, then she pressed mute, set the phone on the high shelf above the spice rack, left it there. By the time the last guests pushed back from their tables, the sun had shifted away from the front windows. Glasses and cups gathered, the floor swept for the first time since morning. Sharon was counting the afternoon register beside the new young employee. Marisol wiped down the stove in slow, steady circles. Julian stood leaning against the back door frame. His jacket hung loose across his shoulders. He watched the last handful of people step out onto the street. Evelyn washed her hands at the stainless steel sink, dried them on a side towel. Then she moved to stand at the kitchen threshold. From that spot she could see the whole room. Tables that had been used hard and well, napkins still half folded, evening light settling across the wood surfaces like something that had decided to stay. Mabel's photograph on the wall. Sharon bent over the register, checking the numbers one more time. Servers laughing quietly with each other after a first day that had never once let up. And on every table, a jar of Blue Porch fig preserve, lid already opened. No one in that room needed to know that Richard had once taken the house. The accounts, the signatures,
No one needed to know how many years Evelyn had spent inside a life where her name appeared nowhere at all. This room had not been built from those things. It stood here because of an old kitchen in Savannah, because of a woman who had cooked figs over a stove many years ago, because of a stack of papers lying still in the dark, and because of a door at the back of a kitchen that Evelyn had opened on the exact day she had nothing left to lose. Not a single person who sat in that room stopped to ask what had come before they walked in, and not one of them needed a long explanation to understand why this flavor was on their table tonight. Each of them carried away a story of their own, left with a memory of their own, and behind them remained a space that went on existing without needing to prove anything further. If you have stayed with this story all the way to here, thank you. If there is someone you think needs to hear it, send it to them. And if you want to keep finding stories like this one, subscribe so you do not miss what comes next.